Okay, so today's daf is Kuf Bet. We're progressing along. We're going to finish Perek Chad Asar today, Perek HaZorek, and move on to the new Perek HaBoneh today. So the Mishnah at the very top of Kuf Bet is where we will be starting out. It's very convenient. Starts right at the top of the daf. HaZorek v'nizkar me'achar she'yatzatam miyado. So a person throws an object in Rishut HaRabim, and we know that you're not allowed to transfer. And by the way, this is pretty much the conclusion of the discussion of transferring. So if you've had enough of Hotza'ah for now, you'll get some new subjects right after this half of a daf here. So somebody who throws an object in Rishut HaRabim, and we know that in order to be culpable for transferring the object, it has to travel a total of 4 amot, which is approximately 6 feet. So somebody does that. They throw the ball, and as soon as it leaves their hand, they realize that it was Shabbat. Okay, they forgot that it was Shabbat, or they forgot that what they were doing was prohibited on Shabbat, whatever the case may be. They threw the object, and as it leaves their hand, they realize it's Shabbat, and obviously there's no way to bring it back. They don't have the force. This is not Star Wars. So, therefore, the ball is going to continue on its trajectory. So then the Mishnah says, Kilata acher, kilata kelev, if a person catches it, or a dog catches it, or shenisrafa, or it burns in midair, it comes into contact with some fire, burns in midair before it lands, so patur, he's exempt. So the Gemara is going to have a little bit of a problem with this, because what's the reason why he's exempt? Is he exempt because he realized what he had done before the action was completed, or is the problem is what makes him exempt that a dog caught it or another person intercepted it? Is it the interception or the change of heart in the middle that makes the difference here? We're going to see. Zarag lasot chabura, you threw something in order to cause a wound. Ben b'adam uben behema, you wanted to cause a wound in a person or an animal, both of which are prohibited on Shabbat. You're not allowed to make a wound in an animal. You're not allowed to make a wound in a person on Shabbat. So you threw your nunchucks or something. I don't know what you threw. You threw something. You threw a knife, and it's in midair, and you realize that it's Shabbat. Whoops! I would have really wounded you another day, but since it's Shabbat, I really shouldn't have done that today. So you regret it. It's flying through the air. So again, patur, because he realized while it was in midair that it was Shabbat, or that it was Shabbat, so he's not going to be culpable for Shabbat now, because it has to be, as we're going to see, a shogeg from the beginning to the end. You have to be in a state of unawareness. In order to be liable to bring a korban chatat, to bring the sin offering, the entire process has to be completed with you in a state of unawareness. But if you correct your mistake and it's just too late to fix it, like, for example, we talked about at the very beginning of the Masekhet, in the first Perek, and we just were reminded of it on Friday, that if a person puts like bread in the oven and then realizes that it's Shabbat halfway through, before it cooks, so again, they wouldn't be liable to bring a korban in that case, because they realized their mistake before the mistake reached its fruition. So here too. So then the Gemara says, Zeh HaKalal, this is the rule, Kol HaChayav Chata'ot Einan Chayavin Ad Shetei Techilatan V'Sofan Shegaga. Techilatan Shegaga V'Sofan Zadon, Techilatan Zadon V'Sofan Shegaga, Piturin Ad Shetei Techilatan V'Sofan Shegaga. So what is the rule? In order for something to be considered a mistake for which you are going to bring a korban chatat, it must be a mistake from beginning to end. If you started out with a mistake but you realized it in midway, and then, so the end of it was done with conscious awareness, or vice versa. You started with conscious awareness and somehow you forgot midway and you completed it in a state of unawareness. It doesn't matter. It's not complete. It has to be from beginning to end unawareness, shegaga, in order to qualify for a korban chatat. Now, obviously, this can only happen in processes where you initiate a process and midway, it takes on a life of its own, basically. Otherwise, it's impossible to imagine these cases, because if in the middle a person realizes, let's say, what they're doing, so they would stop. We would assume. Okay, so we're assuming, we're giving them the benefit of the doubt. So the Gemara asks like this. The first case is very difficult, because the first case says that you threw the ball, it's traveling through the air, and you realized, I just threw a ball on Shabbat, I made a huge mistake, but then Fido comes along and catches it. So what is the reason why I'm not I'm not liable? Is it because Fido intercepted my ball, or is it because I realized that it was Shabbat before my ball reached its destination? Which is the reason? Why does it give me two? It's too complicated, the case. So the Gemara says, Hanacha Chayav, the implication is that if Fido had not intercepted, or if it hadn't burned in midair or whatever happened, okay, that I would have been liable even though I realized midair that it was Shabbat. V'halon nizkar, but he remembered it. Utznana, we just learned in the Mishnah, and you tell me that if I realize it midair, I'm not liable anymore. That doesn't mean it's any better. You still did the action by accident, but since the action didn't reach its objective while you were still unaware, the entirety of the process didn't take place during your shigaga, during your mistake, so therefore you don't bring a korban chatat for that. That's all. So the problem is that the Mishnah clearly says that the only factor is your awareness. So it should be that if I threw the ball and I became aware in the middle, even if it lands where I meant for it to land, I should be patur. It shouldn't have to be that the dog intercepted it. So Amar Rav Kahana says, that the end is talking about this case where it talks about realizing something midway, is talking about a case where you had a little clip or a little wooden piece on the end of a rope, and you threw this in midair. And so Rashi explains that you had this item in your hand, and when you realized it, in other words, when you realized it was Shabbat, what should you have done? You should have yanked it back. Okay? So he says, in that case, since you had the ability to stop it, in other words, so it makes sense. In other words, if you throw the object under a state of unawareness, so you don't have any more effect on that. So what difference does it make? In other words, what difference does it make that now you became aware of it? It's over. Your involvement's over. But if you threw it and it had a string on the end, so then the fact that you became aware midway actually is more significant because you still have the power to pull it back. And let's say you didn't pull it back. Okay, so therefore, Rav Kahana is saying that's the case where awareness makes a difference. So if you threw the ball and you forgot, Rav Kahana says, you didn't realize it was Shabbat, you threw the ball. Then it's in midair and you remembered. And it lands somewhere, okay, you still bring a korban chatat because you threw that ball and that was your involvement, it was over. But if you throw something on a rope and you realize it midway and you didn't yank it back, you basically endorsed the end of your action. Okay? Because you still could have pulled it back and you didn't do it. That's what Rav Kahana says. That's going to be rejected, but that's what he says so far. Okay? So the Gemara asks, Lechtau matna, in a case like that, where you had this item in your hand, Ogdo biyadohu, that wouldn't even be considered carrying, because remember, unless the full entity travels, you're not liable. If you're holding the leash in your hands, we don't even look at the object as having fully moved, because the end of the object, it's all looked at as one object. The thing on the string is all looked at as one object, and the string is in your hand. We don't really look at it as having traveled yet. So how could that even be a case? So what does Rav Kahana say? He says that it's talking about a case not of Shabbat, not of carrying. It's talking about a case of wounding. Okay, it's on Shabbat, but I mean not carrying, but wounding. So what is it? So what's the point? If I threw the ball, I threw my knife at you, or I threw my knife at someone else, hopefully not you, and I wanted to wound them, and then I realized, oh my gosh, it's Shabbat. How could I have done that? But it's too bad. I had thrown it already, forgetting that it was Shabbat the first time, and I don't have any control over it anymore. So the fact that I remember midway doesn't change the nature of the action. But if I threw a knife that I had on a string, because of course I want to pull it back, I don't want you to get the knife because then you might come after me. So I threw this knife on a string, and when I first released it, I forgot that it was Shabbat. Then I realized it was Shabbat, and I said, you know what, the heck with it, I'm going to let it go anyway. So there you really changed from shogeg to mezid in the middle. You changed from shogeg to mezid. You changed from by accident to on purpose. So there, we're going to say you didn't complete the action by accident. You completed the action on purpose. And it's no less of a wounding whether you have the string in your hand or not. See, with carrying, that doesn't work, because if you throw the object and you have the string in your hand, it didn't really travel, because you still are holding the string. But wounding someone, it doesn't matter that you still have the string in your hand, you wounded them. So that's how Rav Kahana tries to solve this. But Hanami Tanena, but this was also in the Mishnah Rav Kahana, because it says Hazorek lasut chabura ben be'adam ben bebehema v'nizkar shelo nasit chabura patur. But the Mishnah already has that case. The Mishnah already has that case. So what's the first case of the Mishnah then, according to you, Rav Kahana? So Ela Amar Rava, rather Rava says b'ma'avir. We are talking about carrying. V'hazeh klal de katane azrika katane. There's a difference between carrying an object and throwing an object. Okay, Ela. So Rava says Ela Amar Rava b'ma'avir. Okay, it's talking about carrying it on your person. So since you're carrying it on your person, and you started walking bishogeg, but then you realized that it was Shabbat, and you continued b'mezid, that's what it's talking about in the beginning. So the Gemara says v'hazeh klal de katane azrika katane. But isn't the Mishnah talking about throwing, not walking? And in throwing, we all have to agree. In other words, the problem here is that once you release the object, how does your intention change the nature of the action? So he wanted to say it's talking about carrying it on your person. The Gemara says, no, it's clearly talking about throwing it. And even though you've released it already, and you no longer have an effect on the action, still, if you change your intention, you can change the impact of that action completing itself. So Ela Amar Rava, rather Rava says, Tarte Katane. There are two cases here. Hazorek ben nizkar me'achar she'azatam yado inami lo nizkar v'uklata acher o klata kelev o shenisrafa patur. I would have said that this reading is the simplest reading. So if I had been reading this Mishnah myself and trying to make sense out of it, that's how I would have interpreted it. That it's two different cases. In other words, the Mishnah says somebody threw an object and they realized after it left their hand that it was Shabbat, and therefore they're not bishogeg anymore. Or they didn't realize it was Shabbat, but it was caught by a dog, or it burned in midair, or it was it was intercepted. These are two different cases. In either one, either my intention changed, or my purpose, my original action didn't reach its objective. In either case, I'm exempt. See, it's not saying that you need both conditions, that you changed your mind and it was intercepted. It's saying just one of the two conditions. So that's what Rava says. Rav Ashi Amar, Rav Ashi says, Chasore mechasra v'achi katane. It's actually missing a piece, and this is what it should say. Hazorek v'nizkar me'achar she'atztam yado kilata acher o kilata kelev o shenisrafa patur. Hanacha chayav. Okay. Bamed dvarim amurim shechazar v'shachach. Aval lo chazar v'shachach patur shekol chayavei chataot enan chayavin ad shtei tchilatan v'sofan shegaga. He says, actually, we can say that we can learn the Mishnah the way that we originally did. That if you threw the object and you realized in midair that it was Shabbat, then if it gets intercepted, you're exempt. And if it doesn't get intercepted, the implication would be, or if it doesn't burn in midair, the implication would be, you'd still be liable. So it says, when is that true? When you went back and forgot again. Only when you went back and forgot again. In other words, that's the missing part of the Mishnah. That if you threw the object, everyone agrees apparently, if you threw the object by accident, you forgot it was Shabbat, and then you remembered when it was in midair, so you can never be obligated in bringing a korban chatat, because before it reached its objective, you had already changed your mind, so to speak. You had already become aware. He says, however, what's the case where it matters what the result is? And it shouldn't matter what the result is, whether a dog intercepted it or not. He says, what if you threw the object? You threw it a really long way, apparently, because when you threw the object, you remembered it was Shabbat. I'm sorry, you forgot it was Shabbat when you threw the object. Then you remembered it was Shabbat, and then you forgot again. Okay? And then you forgot again, and it landed in where it was supposed to land. So the fact that in the middle, for a moment, you remembered it was Shabbat, doesn't erase the fact, because what does the Mishnah say? If tchilatan v'sofan shegaga. If the beginning is a mistake in the end, so we don't care that in the middle you had a moment where you realized that it was Shabbat. The fact is, when you first initiated the action, you forgot, and when it ended, you had forgotten. When it was completed, you had forgotten. So that's the case where, if a dog happened to intercept it, you'll get lucky. Because since your action didn't reach its objective, you'll be exempt. But otherwise, as long as the beginning of the action was undertaken bishgaga by accident, and it concluded bishgaga by accident where you were unaware that it was Shabbat, you're going to be exempt. No matter what, even though in the middle you came to realize that it was Shabbat. So that's how he resolves the case. He says, in that case where you forgot, realized and forgot again, now you have one more saving possibility, which is if Fido comes and he catches it, so your action didn't reach its objective, then you could still be exempt from bringing the korban. So this is the way that they learn the Mishnah. But basically in the end, Rav Ashi and Rava are trying to resolve it the same way. They both agree that if you forgot it was Shabbat and threw the object, and in the middle you remembered it was Shabbat, you would not be liable to bring a korban chatat. They all agree on that in the end. The Gemara goes on, this is the rule. Anybody, when it comes to, with respect to being obligated for a sin offering, the only time you're obligated is if the complete action took place while you were unaware. So, Itmar, we had the following statement, Shetei amot b'shogeg, Shetei amot b'mezid. Shetei amot b'shogeg. What happens if a person carried an object 2 amot by accident? So he forgot it was Shabbat, he carried it 2 amot. Then he realized it was Shabbat, and he said, you know what, I don't care. He walked another 2 amot. Then he forgot it was Shabbat again, walked another 2 amot. So what's the total? 6. Okay? Now what would you at first think? Well, he did the 2 amot b'shogeg, but he completed the action b'mezid, because 4 amot is a complete transfer. So the first 2 were b'shogeg by accident, but the last 2 were on purpose. So he actually completed the action on purpose, but then he did another 2 by accident. So if we combined the first 2 and the last 2, we would have a total of 4 amot that had traveled when he was in a state of unawareness. But he has the middle 2 where he knew what was going on. So what do we say to this? So Rabbah says patur. Since those last 2 amot were b'mezid, in other words, the last of the first 4 were b'mezid, therefore he's exempt because he did it on purpose. So he's exempt from a sin offering. Rava Amar Chayav. Rava says he's liable. Rava Amar Patur Rafil Rabban Gamliel da Amar En Yedia Lachatzi Shiur Hatamud Dekika Gamar Shiura B'Shogeg Gamar Aval Hachad B'Mezid Lo. So Rava says as follows. Here's my reason why he should be exempt. Because there's a case called Yedia Lachatzi Shiur, which Rabban Gamliel says, let's say a person forgot it was Shabbat and he wrote a letter. 1 letter. Then he remembered it was Shabbat. He said, oh shoot, I just wrote a letter on Shabbat, what a fool I am. But then he forgot again and he wrote another letter. And then he said, oh shoot, what did I do? So one possibility is that, what he realized in between didn't really make a difference. Because he hadn't done anything yet. 1 letter is not enough, you need at least 2 letters to violate Shabbat. So the first time he became aware and realized he had written a letter, it really didn't have any significance. That's En Yedia Lachatzi Shiur. Because the awareness that he had doesn't make a difference because 1 letter isn't significant anyway. So we're not going to divide his action into 2 actions. We're going to say it's all 1 action because the first letter, when he realized he had written it, didn't mean anything. Only when he wrote the second letter and realized it, did it mean something. Because then he really could be liable for 2 letters. So we just look at it as he wrote 2 letters and then became aware of it. The awareness he had in the middle didn't have any halachic meaning. So Rabbah is saying that so too here. He said even according to him. So you might say, well, Rabban Gamliel will say that En Yedia Lachatzi Shiur, that what you become aware of in the middle doesn't make a difference. So maybe what he'll say in our case is the first 2 amot that you carried the object, you were unaware. Then you became aware for 2 amot. And then you forgot again for another 2 amot. That 2 amot that you became aware doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. Why not? Because you had only carried 2 amot so far. Then you became aware. You carried another 2. Then you forgot again and you carried 2 more. The first 2, when you became aware, didn't really count for anything, the awareness, because you hadn't done anything yet, halachically. But there's a difference, because over there, so he says, even Rabban Gamliel would agree that you're exempt here. When you write 1 letter, realize it, and then forget and write the other letter, Rabban Gamliel says you're liable. Because the awareness you had in the middle wasn't significant. But here, he would agree that you're not liable. Why are you not liable? Because here, you did those 2 things. In other words, over there, both letters were written by accident. Just that you were aware in between. Here, you became aware, and you actually did 2 more b'mezid. So you completed the action of 4 amot of transfer, aware of what you were doing. He said he's not going to say that's one complete action of bishogeg. How could Rabban Gamliel say it's a complete action of bishogeg? You did the last 2 amot on purpose. So how can you now bring a korban chatat for that? How can you bring a sin offering for that? You can't. So he says, now the Gemara says, what are we talking about here? Now obviously, if we were talking here about a mistake, in other words, that the person threw the object, we couldn't be talking about it. We couldn't be talking about a case where you threw the object, because then there wouldn't be a difference, because you started it by accident and it ended by accident. Rather, ella b'ma'avir. Right? So, rather, we must be talking about a case where you are carrying the object, and therefore you carried it to amot on purpose, and you carried it to amot and completed the action b'mezid. Okay, you completed it b'mezid, and then you did 2 more, but the 2 more doesn't really help us. It doesn't really make a difference. Okay? So he says that therefore, the fact is that since he could have stopped, in other words, since he could have stopped midway when he realized it the first time, and he didn't, he just kept going for another 2 amot, we can't say he completed the action b'shogeg. If he had thrown the object, we could say, okay, he started out b'shogeg, he realized in the middle, and finished b'shogeg. There was nothing, he couldn't have stopped it in the middle, he'd already thrown it. But here, the reality is, he realized when he was carrying the object midway, and he should have stopped. He didn't stop. He completed it b'mezid, and since he completed it on purpose, we can't go and now let him bring a korban chatat. Let him bring a sin offering. And now, it should say, so here, one second. So what does that Gimel tell us? It tells us, what should it say? Rava, okay. Right, so it should say Rava, not Rabbah. Right, so Rava Amar Chayav Fa'afilu Rabbanan Damar Yesh Yidi Ala Chatzi Shur. So Rava says the opposite. He says, no, I disagree with you. Or it would seem like a disagreement, but it turns out they don't disagree. Rava says, I disagree with you, and in this case where you transferred it 2 amot by accident, and then 2 amot on purpose, and then 2 more amot by accident, you would be liable for a sin offering, even according to the rabbis, who say that yediyah lachatzi shi'ur, that if you become aware in the middle, like when you wrote the 1 letter by accident, and then you realized, and then you wrote the other letter, they would say you're not liable, because that becoming aware in the middle splits the 2. So why here do we not say that your awareness in the middle splits the 2? That you carried for 2 amot, you realized what you were doing, and then you carried 2 more. Why is that not splitting the 2 actions? So Rava says it doesn't matter, because there's a difference. Hatamud biyado aval hacha de en biyado mai. So the Gemara says that. So Rava says because there's a difference over there. Rabban Gamliel, in the case with Rabban Gamliel and the Chachamim about writing the letters, you could have stopped in the middle. Here, you didn't have a choice to stop in the middle. That really, it turns out that Rabban and Rava weren't disagreeing at all. It depends on the case. In other words, Rabbah was talking about a case where you actually are carrying it, and therefore you have the ability to stop the action in the middle, and since you didn't stop it and you continued, we look at the last 2 amot that you did as being done in a state of awareness, and you can't say that the 4 amot were done in a state of unawareness. Rava was talking about a case where you threw it. So he says in a case where you threw it, it's actually more bishogeg. There's more bishogegness in that case. There's more inadvertentness in that case. Why? Because once you threw it, there was nothing you could do to retract it. So whereas in the case of the writing of letters, becoming aware in the middle has a significance because you could have stopped things midway. But here, becoming aware in the middle didn't have any effect because let's say you threw it. In other words, the case of Rabbah and Rava are 2 different ones. Rabbah was talking about a case where you're walking, you walked the first 2 amot, you forgot it was Shabbat, then you realized it was Shabbat, you walked 2 more amot anyway. And then you forgot again, you walked 2 more amot. So the fact was, you could have stopped midway. The fact that you became aware after 2 amot meant that you were purposely finishing the 4 amot of transfer 1 second on purpose, right? Whereas the other case, where you throw the object, okay, you forgot it was Shabbat, you threw the object. It traveled 2 amot, by accident. Then you realized, oh my gosh, it's Shabbat, and it traveled 2 more amot, and then you forgot again. It landed b'shogeg. You couldn't have done anything in the middle anyway. So you know what? We just sum it up and say the whole thing was b'shogeg. So it's not similar to the case of writing letters, where in the middle you could have stopped yourself. So that's why Rabban Rav are really saying 2 different cases. When you throw it, the becoming aware in the middle doesn't make a difference, because you couldn't change the trajectory anyway. When you're walking, becoming aware in the middle does make a difference, because you should have stopped your action and you continued on. So actually that case is more similar to the case that's argued between Rabban Gamliel and the Chachamim, where there was an opportunity for you to stop in the middle. Okay? But it's not similar to the case of the Chachamim and Rabban Gamliel, because you actually finished the action on purpose, rather than finishing it by accident. Yes?
Then last 4 you do it mazid, you're still within the range of less than 4 amot, so you can carry 4 amot. You didn't break any law.
But you did it b'mezid, you said.
I know, yes. If you're allowed to carry 4 amot, under 4 amot.
Under it, let's say, yeah.
So the first 2, the fact that you did bishkaga doesn't add up to the last 4. So, can you?
Well, it's really an issue of, did you do one complete action that we can hold you responsible for? So since your attitude changed in the middle, the nature of the action changes in the middle. So the way that we look at it halachically. So in this case, they're saying that actually both Rabban Gamliel and the Chachamim would agree in this case. In the case of throwing, they would agree that you're becoming aware in the middle doesn't make a difference. And in the case of walking, they would agree that you're becoming aware in the middle does make a difference, because you actually complete the other 2 amot b'mezid, whereas in the case of writing, you did both letters b'shogeg, just that you realized in the middle that you had messed up. Okay? So that's basically where it concludes on that point. And now, Amar Rabba says, Zarag ben achava via kelevo pia kivshan chayav. It says if you threw your object and it landed in the mouth of a dog, or it landed in the furnace and burned up, you're still liable. But didn't we learn in the Mishnah, didn't we learn that if the dog catches it, or if it lands and it burns up, that you're exempt? It depends. If you wanted Fido to catch it, or you wanted to throw it into the furnace and it traveled 4 amot and landed in the furnace, why is that a problem? That's what you wanted to do. So of course your action completed its goal, and you're liable for violating Shabbat. Amar Rav Bevai bar Abaye. Rav Bevai bar Abaye said, Afana namitanena. We learned this in a Mishnah. Yesh ochel achila achat. A person can eat one eating. V'chayav aleha arba chataot. And he can actually be liable for 4 sin offerings for one eating. What is it? Ve'asham echad, and 1 guilt offering. What is the nature of this prohibition? Hatameh, the person himself is tameh. Ve'achal chelev, and he ate fat. And what kind of chelev was it? Ve'hu notar min hamuktashin. B'yom kippurim. Okay, so he did a lot of things wrong. He's tameh and eating holy fats. So first of all, he's a tameh eating fats. He's a tameh eating a korban. He's eating forbidden fats. That's another problem. The forbidden fat was notar. It was left over from a korban. It's Yom Kippur. Okay? So, and he's misappropriating. The reason for the asham is he's also misappropriating from the Beit HaMikdash. Okay? So that's a case of me'ilah. Asham me'ilot that we read about all the time. He's misappropriating. So that's 4 chataot. A tamei she'achal kodesh, a tamei person eating a holy thing, eating chelev, eating notar, and eating on Yom Kippur. That's 4. And then the 5th thing is that he's misappropriating the property of the Beit HaMikdash. So Rabbi Meir Omer, af im hayta Shabbat v'otzio b'fiv chayav. Rabbi Meir says, and I can add another one, because let's say he puts the food in his mouth and he walks from the Reshut HaYachid into the public domain on Shabbat. Let's say it was Shabbat and he walked out. That's another chatat, because then he's also violating carrying on Shabbat in his mouth. Rulo, they said to him, Eno min Hashem. That is not of the same nature, because it's not the eating that's the violation, it's the transfer that's the violation. So we're looking at a case one eating can make you obligated, not where the eating is also a transfer because you walked while you were eating. That's a different thing. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. That's a different thing. Okay, so, but anyway, ve'amai, ha'en derech hotza'ah bekach. But is this really the way to carry things in your mouth? Why is it agreed upon that carrying the food in your mouth is considered carrying? Ela kevan deka mechaven machashavto meshavya le'makom. That the point here is that what is the problem? The problem is that when you throw the object and the dog catches it, did it land in a place in a place that's appropriate for? Normally, when you do a hanacha, when something comes to rest, when you've carried it, you've picked it up in one domain and you've brought it to rest in another domain. It has to rest on a place of 4x4 tefachim. That's a stable place. Here, it's landing in Fido's mouth. So how does that work? So you see from this Mishnah that carrying in your mouth, if you decide you want to carry it that way, you want to eat it, then your mouth takes on the significance of a place that's appropriate for resting an object. So too here, in the case of the dog catching it, we see that even though normally that wouldn't be a place that you would consider a place to rest an object on the mouth of a dog, but since you wanted the object to go into the mouth of the dog, you give it that significance. And we say, Hadran ala chazorek, Hadran ala chazorek, Hadran ala chazorek, and we can leave behind us for a little while, or for a while, discussions of transfer of objects, which have given us a great headache and lots of mental gymnastics. Now we come to something a little bit easier to handle, which is the new Perek Haboneh. As we turn to Amud Bet Haboneh, Kama Yivneh V'Chayav. How much do you have to build on Shabbat that you would be chayav, that you would be liable? Haboneh Kol Shehu. Even the smallest amount of building you are liable for on Shabbat. V'Misatet. And a person who what's the word in English? When you cut rocks. I'm trying to think of the word for it. Chisel. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you very much. Chiseling rocks, chiseling at rock. V'amakeba patish, or if you smack with a hammer, or b'ma'atzad, or with a larger type of a hammer, mallet. V'akodech kosho, or you drill something, chayav. All of these things are chayav because of boneh or because of makeba patish. These are two different melachot actually. One melacha is called boneh, building. One is called makeba patish, hitting the final hammer blow. And as we're going to learn, pretty much the rule is boneh is making something, okay? But makeba patish is putting the finishing touch on something, okay? So it's called hitting with the hammer because that was the last action that they used to do when they were done with a malacha. They would hit with the hammer on the anvil, so it's called hitting makeba patish. But we're going to see that basically whenever you finish something off, even if you're not adding to its structure in a significant way, that would be boneh, it's considered a malacha in its own right. So this is the rule. Anybody who does a malacha and their malacha is going to last b'Shabbat, and they do this malacha on Shabbat, chayav. They are liable for construction or whatever they did on Shabbat. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Afa makeh b'kurnas ala sadan, even a person who bangs on the anvil with his hammer, b'shad melacha, chayav mipnei shu kemitaken melacha, that the person who bangs on the anvil with his hammer on Shabbat is also chayav, that's also a separate melacha, and we're going to see why that's considered a separate melacha in a little bit. The Gemara says, Kol shehu lemay chazia. Why is it? Normally we say that on Shabbat, the only time that you are liable for something is when you do Malechet Machashevet. When you do something which is a substantial action that really makes a difference. What is a tiny bit of building? Why is it that there's no minimum measurement for building and an infinitesimal amount is significant? The answer is, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah says, because a poor person will dig the tiniest little hole in the ground to hide his money, which is very little, obviously, because he's a poor person. Similar to what they used to do in the Mishkan. Because remember, in the Mishkan, he says, they used to dig a tiny hole in the ground to hide their needles in the ground that they were using for the weaving. So it was part of the Malechet HaMishkan, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, to make tiny little holes in the ground. And that's boneh, that's building. Abaye says, what are you talking about? That's not true. Nobody's going to put their needles in the ground. That will cause them to rust. That would be a really bad idea. That what would the poor person do that is a tiny amount of building? He would make a tiny little stand for his pot to cook it over the fire. He has a little pot because he's poor, so he makes a very little stand, and that very little stand is to cook his very little food. litzboa yiriot shechasra melachtan, that this was exactly the same thing as in the Mishkan. Because remember, we have to learn everything from the Mishkan. So that's why they mention what a person does normally, and they mention the Mishkan. That a person in the Mishkan, they would make, when they would dye things, what would they cook for the Melechet HaMishkan? They would cook the dyes. Okay? So what would they do? They would make a little leg to hold up the pot over the fire. Pitputek kiraktana lishapot yoraktana, to put on it a little a pot to make the dyes. So since they would sometimes have to order a very small amount of dye, let's say they needed to add some dye or they need a little bit, so they would make a very small pot of dye, and so even a small amount of construction is significant, because the tiny amount that they would need to make a little leg to hold this pot up is all that you need. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar in aniyut b'mkom ashirut. What are you talking about? In the Beit HaMikdash, in the Mishkan, they would never make small amounts of anything. In aniyut b'mkom ashirut, where you have wealth, you don't do things in a poor way. You do things in a grand way, in a fabulous way. You're not going to make tiny little amounts of dye just to patch things. That wasn't what they were doing in the Mishkan. They were doing things on a major scale. So therefore, Ela sheken balabayit sheyesh lo nekev bebirato. Rather, even a wealthy man who has a hole in his palace, you don't think he's going to plug the hole? V'sotemo, he's going to close it up. Dekavata gabe mishkan sheken keresh shenav labodarna matif letocha avar v'sotemo. He says, no, just like a rich person, don't compare the Mishkan to a poor person, compare it to a rich person. Just like a rich person whose palace has a little hole in it, he's going to take some lead and close up the hole. So too in the Mishkan, if they had one of the boards of the Mishkan that had a worm that ate a little hole in it, they would fill it and fix it. So that small amount of fixing that they would do to repair a breach in the board is significant for them, and that's where we learn that even a small amount of building is significant on Shabbat. So then we say, Amar Shmuel says, that if a person positions a rock, in other words, we're talking about he's positioning it for building, for construction, even if he just positions it on the ground, that's considered building on Shabbat. Maybe there is an objection. We learned that if two people come to build, one person puts down the rocks and one person puts the cement, it's the one who put the cement that's liable. Just putting a rock in position is not building. You need to put the cement there. The Gemara says, "Uletamech." According to you, what about the end? Rabbi Yossi Omer v'afilo he'elav v'hiniach al gabei dimos shel avanim chayav. Rabbi Yossi said that even if you just place a rock on top of a bunch of other rocks, and that's the last rock, the top rock, that's enough to be considered building. So what do you mean? You don't need cement. You don't even need to position it. You can just put it down. So what's going on here? There were three different stages of building. Tata, metzi'ah, ve'ilah. Tata ba'etzidudei ve'afra. There are three levels. When you're doing the bottom stone, you're constructing something out of stone. So the bottom stone, what is considered building with respect to the bottom stone? Positioning it in the dirt in such a way that it's going to be stable. What about the stones on top of that? Cement is necessary. What about the top stone that you place? The top stone, just placing it there on top of the other ones, is the last step in the process. So for the bottom stone, adjusting it in the ground is the melacha. For the middle stone, cementing them in is the melacha. And for the top stone, just placing it on top is the melacha. We go on to find a machloket about the fine line between these two melachot of boneh and makeh b'patish. Where do we... Yeah. Yeah. It would sound like it would be. Yeah. So there's a fine line between the two, because where do we draw the line between building and putting on the finishing touches? Sometimes it's both. Sometimes they overlap. And here are three cases where Rav and Shmuel argue about which classification. Because remember, makeh b'patish could be a type of building, but it's a finishing touch of the building. So it's also building though. So where do you draw the line? So that's the discussion. So Rav says, so the first question is, you said chiseling rock into shape is prohibited, but which melacha is it? Rav Amar Mishum Boneh, Rav says it's building. Ushmuel Amar Mishum Makeh b'patish, Shmuel says it's because you are putting the finishing touches, you're chiseling it into shape. It's not building. Always. Or b'mezid, if you did a b'mezid, that's what you would be doing wrong. Because if you're going to tell somebody, if you're going to warn them about violating Shabbat, you have to tell them what they're doing. Right? Which violation they're doing. Let's say you make a hole in the chicken coop, that they would make a hole, an air hole in the chicken coop. Rav Amar Mishum Boneh, Rav says that's building. Shmuel Amar Mishum Makeh B'Patish. Shmuel says, again, it's the finishing touch, because after you've constructed the lul shel tarnagolim, after you've constructed the chicken coop, you make a hole in it. And the third case is Ayil Shufta B'Kupina. If you take a metal tool and you attach the handle, the wooden handle, they would have a peg that they would attach the handle, they would stick it in to make sure that the handle was attached, let's say, to a blade. If you have like some kind of tool that's made of two pieces, that peg that they would put in to complete the tool. So according to Shmuel, again, according to Rav Amar Mishum Boneh, Rav says that's building. You constructed the tool. Shmuel Amar Mishum Patish. Shmuel says you didn't make anything new. You just put them together, so it's like really putting the finishing touches on it. And we need all three of these cases. Why? Because if you're going to tell me the first case, namely the case of chiseling rock, that's why Rav said it's building, because chiseling really looks like construction. But maybe he would agree that making a hole in the chicken coop, poking a hole in something is not building. We don't think of that as construction. Maybe he would have agreed, and yet he doesn't. He still thinks it's construction. And if you told me about the chicken coop, maybe you'll tell me it's similar. Even the chicken coop case, making a hole, it's similar to a building, because after all, you make a hole in the building, it's called windows. Right? However, but when you're connecting the hoe, you have the metal piece and you have the handle, you're connecting them together. There, maybe the inderech binyan bekach, that's not really building, it's not construction. So there, maybe maybe he'll agree with Shmuel. And if all you had was the last case of putting the utensil together, putting the gardening tool together, maybe that's where Shmuel disagrees, but the other two cases of chiseling rock or of making a hole in the chicken coop, maybe he would have agreed with Rav. That's why you need all three cases. Tricha. Ba'amine, Rav Natan bar Oshaya, Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Natan bar Oshaya asked Rabbi Yochanan the following question: what is the bottom line? What are you violating when you chisel rock? He showed him with his hand beating the hammer on the anvil. In other words, what you're violating is makeh b'patish, finishing something off because you're putting it into its final shape. What about the fact that our Mishnah says as two different things? One who chisels rock and one who strikes the hammer. So how can you say that it comes under the category of makeh b'patish, of striking with the hammer? Really take out the vav. It's describing it. It's saying the one who chisels is one who hits with the hammer. In other words, who's putting the finishing touches onto something. Tashmakam, and listen. We turn to Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph. We're just going to finish off this discussion here. Somebody who drills is chayav, is liable. So we understand Rav, because Rav says even making a hole in a chicken coop is a melachav binyan. It's considered building. So drilling a hole in something, we would say why that's building. But according to Shmuel, it doesn't seem like making drilling a hole is binyan. Because according to Shmuel, you have to do something, you have to construct something, you have to make something for it to be binyan. Making a hole is not good enough. So what case would Shmuel agree that drilling is considered to be a type of building? That's only in the following case. Basically, when you drill a hook into something. In other words, you drill a hook, let's say, into a piece of wood. So you're making a hole, but what are you actually leaving in there? You're leaving the metal hook in. So it's meant to be, it's a constructive action of drilling. Just drilling a hole, Shmuel would say, unless the hole is by itself. If the hole is just to be a hole, then he would say, it's makeh b'patish. You're putting the finishing touches on. But what case would it be that you're considered to be, when would drilling, which is not the finishing touches, in other words, drilling a hole, just drilling a hole is not going to be construction. So when is Shmuel going to say that drilling a hole is construction? only when you're drilling in a hook into an item. As Rashi says, you're taking a long nail or whatever it is, let's say a hook, and you're making it a part of this entity. You're making it a hook on the entity. So therefore, it's considered binyan according to Shmuel. According to Rav, even a regular drilling of a hole could be binyan because it's part of the process of building, and he considered even making a hole in the chicken coop to be binyan. He doesn't require it to be a making of something to qualify as building, but Shmuel does, and therefore drilling for him is only when you're drilling in order to implant something in something else. Have a great day, everybody.